This is Radical Love Live, an ongoing series of podcasts and special events where we explore faith outside the boxes. Hosted by Mark Dilcom and Kelly Wilson.
So, hey, Kelly.
Hey, Mark, how are you?
I am well. In fact, I'm freaking awesome.
You are. You look like you're freaking awesome.
I am. Life is great. 2024 is starting out just so well for me. We're together.
That's right.
We're recording another episode. We're leaning into a new season here with all kinds of great things in store, including today. And how are you, my friend?
I'm good. It's sunny outside. I still have yet to break out my winter coat.
I know.
In fact, I'm still wearing sandals with socks. I can do that.
Oh, yeah. So that's
I
a
don't
definite dad look.
Yeah, I don't care about fashion anymore. Totally done.
Oh, come on. So what are we talking about today, my friend?
Today, we're going to talk about the big topic of narcissism.
Whoa. Are you calling me a narcissist?
Not at all.
Okay.
Or do you feel like you're a narcissist?
Some people might think I am.
I'd say, listening to the book by the author we're talking to today, there were some things in there where I definitely recognized narcissism in some people I knew and had to kind of check myself a little bit. There were a couple things where I'm like, maybe I'm not as comfortable with my human limitations. Anyway, today we're going to be talking with our friend, Dr. Chuck DeGroat. He is the author of When Narcissism Comes to Church.
Oh my.
Healing Your Community from Emotional and Spiritual Abuse, which is entirely in line with
that is my passion. Absolutely. So I'm looking forward to this.
So Chuck is a professor of pastoral care and Christian spirituality at Western Theological Seminary in Holland, Michigan, and a senior fellow at Newbigin House of Studies in San Francisco. He's also a licensed therapist, spiritual director, author of a couple of other books, The Toughest People to Love and Wholeheartedness. We're really grateful to have Chuck here today. So thank you for being here. It's great to see you in your winter wonderland.
Yeah, greetings from the snow globe, you guys, from Grand Rapids, Michigan, where we've got a blizzard coming through. So yeah, it's good to come to you. My snow globe protects me from spiritual abuse. So it's really helpful.
If we only
all
superpowers.
Yeah. If you can make that happen, Chuck, you've got something. Let me tell you. Well, it's good to have you on here. So, Kelly, you've got some questions. So, fire away.
Yeah, let's start right in talking about narcissism. That a lot of us feel like we have some kind of working definition of narcissism. It's been talked about a lot in the news and, op-ed pieces over the last, like since the 2016 election. There's certain politicians that have been diagnosed both clinically and by armchair psychologists as narcissistic. And we hear, and I always thought I knew what narcissism was. I remember hearing the mythical story of Narcissus who's gazing at himself in the water and, loves himself too much. But in your book, you explore some more technical and also I think some more spiritual definitions of narcissism. So maybe we should start with talking about just like, what is narcissism?
Yeah, well, so that's such a good question. And you're right. I do try to sort of expand it, particularly using the Enneagram as a lens to look at 9 different faces of narcissism, right? But when you're talking about sort of the classic psychological understanding of it, you're talking about things like grandiosity and attention seeking and entitlement, low empathy. And so when you see these op-eds about particular politicians who we shall not name, who we hope will never become president again, we maybe see some of those classic definitions, right? That grandiosity, that attention seeking. But I try to nuance narcissism a bit, right? And even take the story all the way back to the early story of Scripture. Trying to understand that as I talk about in the book, narcissism is born out of an evasion of longing, an avoidance of our limitations. It's born out of a sense of control. And so, and we see that show up in the 9 faces of narcissism, these 9 different forms of 9 different false selves in a sense, right? 9 different ways of trying to make life work in the world. And so I think it's really important not just to talk about the kind of the classic psychological definition that looks at grandiosity and entitlement, but also that evasion of longing, that avoidance of human limitation, and that desire for control that each of us has.
So would you say that that idea of the narcissist as someone who simply loves themselves is not exactly a correct way of thinking about it?
Yeah, that's way too simplistic. And I think my sense is that narcissism is born out of one who hasn't learned to love himself or herself, right? Narcissism is
Mhm.
actually born out of shame. It's born out of
Mhm.
self-disgust, self-contempt. The
Mhm.
one who is anchored in love, is well attached, knows she's loved, experiences delight, loved, her beloved, all those kinds of things. She's not going to be prone to grasping for that love in some other way. And so yeah, it's too simplistic and really unhelpful to say that narcissism is simply self-love.
Mhm.
So, Chuck, I'm a, it's fascinating because I'm glad we started with this because, first of all, it kind of blows my definition of what I thought a narcissist was. But it's something you just said and something that I feel internal. So, based on if somebody truly loves themselves in a healthy, holistic way, are they capable of being a narcissist? And I would almost posit that it would be difficult because, to your point, the narcissism actually is a result of somebody not having the ability to love themselves, that they actually are, they have suffered some damage through whatever form, including shame, trauma, abuse, et cetera, all. So it's the masking. So if somebody is whole, they really, they wouldn't, they really almost would not have the capacity to be a narcissist.
I think that's spot on. I mean, I think narcissism is really a self-protective system, right? And you're exactly right. It's born out of trauma and shame and hurt people who hurt people, right?
Yep.
As Richard Rohr says, you don't transform your pain, you're bound to transmit it, right? And so
Yeah.
there's that sense in which narcissism really is. This is, by the way, where I find empathy for those who are on the narcissistic spectrum because they're in pain and they're simply living out of these self-protective mechanisms. Imagine a fortress wall and they're just throwing grenades over the fortress wall and they're incapable of really entering into vulnerable relationship with someone else. And that's a terrifying and lonely place to be.
What's
Mm.
amazing is that some of the people that are in these, in these positions or in this habit that you're talking about right now are actually praised for the qualities that they exude as a narcissist.
Yeah.
Can you talk about that a little bit about how some leadership positions that some of these qualities get, um, that people are attracted to these qualities, or they transform them into something positive that they're not.
Yeah. Yeah, they really cut both ways. I mean, it's interesting because my work with this really goes back to the late 90s, early 2000s in the church planting world and in and around church planter assessments where, the assessment was practically a setup for narcissism. Was you kind of go through and look at the different categories and you'd say, on the one hand, I understand that a church planter ought to be, let's say, inspiring and yet we weren't interrogating those categories or interrogating the person well enough, right?
Mhm.
We were simply saying, well, he's inspiring and he's influential and he's a great communicator and he's fantastic on the stage and no one was asking in service of what or why or what's going on there or what, what's the backstory. And so we were simply sort of accepting what we were seeing at face value. And so we want to sort of interrogate some of those categories, right?
It's interesting. You don't often, it seems like the opposite of that would be, finding leaders that are humble, vulnerable,
Yeah.
aware of their limitations, but we don't often look
Yeah.
for those. Like that's not usually on the job description.
No, that wasn't on the church planner assessment, it turns out.
Yeah.
Vulnerability, humility, curiosity, which has become my favorite word. No, that you don't find those things. You look for someone with certainty. You look for someone who walks around with a kind of confidence and even gravitas, right? And this is where, even now, as I'm talking to people who've been in and around church planning for 20 years, uh, many are second guessing not just the assessments, but the systems that, you know, uh, that have enabled this.
Mhm. So I'm going to ask the question then, is since that was your experience and you saw the assessment tool and, and now reflect back on that, like, okay, there's probably a different way we should go about that. Is this almost sounds systematic with a lot of denominations, and I'm not going to pick on any particular ones because that's not what this is about, but
Yeah.
I just feel like what you just said, I thought, wow, you're right. So many probably use this as their tool to say, oh, you're vibrant and you present well and you can communicate and you can engage, and not even thinking about, well, or maybe they did think about, maybe they did know some of the weaker areas of a pastor or somebody who's going to be a spiritual leader in this community and congregation. And they're like, yeah, we'll live with that. And are we not seeing some of the consequences today of that? And maybe it's actually been going on for years, but it's just because of social media and awareness and everything else that like people are realizing, we have some unhealthy situations going on here.
Yeah, and I often say it's not 20 years old, it's not 30 years old. I mean, we're talking about sort of a Constantinian imperialist kind of mentality.
Yeah.
This goes way, way back, right?
Right.
And
Yeah.
so the systems we've just sort of inherited over the centuries, systems that ennoble power and confidence and certainty, um, these kinds of things over humility, curiosity, vulnerability. I mean, I remember, I remember years ago, even if I used the language of vulnerability, they'd say, "Shh, no, 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 we don't want that. That we don't want men who are vulnerable." I don't know, quite what you're getting at there, Chuck, but we don't want weak men going into church planting. Obviously, this was in a very patriarchal, complementarian context, right? And so
Right. Right.
uh, so they were weary of words, afraid of words like that.
Wow. Wow. Does that start to become sort of a gender stereotype issue where, we're talking about, we want our men to be stereotypical men and
Yeah.
not
Yeah.
show womanly
Yeah.
virtues?
Yeah.
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 Yeah, that's exactly it. And you probably are aware of the church planting world dominated by men. It's largely patriarchal, and having worked with many, many men over many years. I mean, I've done hundreds, if not thousands of assessments over the years. Many of them are scared. They are fragile, like I am, by the way. They are fearful. They do carry around stories of shame. There is some pain or trauma from their past. And yet there's no invitation to be known, for that to be a part of their story, for the shame to be metabolized and digested so that there's growing sense of health and healthy self-confidence versus kind of an unhealthy superiority. And uh, so yeah, it's been going on for a long time, and it's not just about the personality of one church planter, but it's sort of baked into our systems.
So can we go back? You mentioned something and I've not considered that. So if we go back to the very beginning of church, uh, so at what point was it? Was it in the first 100 years in the early? Is it more morphed from an experience more into the philosophy than into the institutions of early church that an authoritarian position took, and because it was a male dominated culture, of course, back then. This is. Are you? Did I hear you say that this started way back when?
Yeah.
It's been brought forward.
Well, I mean, I think the story can go back even further. I mean, you see
Okay.
these stories in scripture, right?
Yeah.
You see power and ego and manipulation and exploitation of women in particular, right? And all of this, right? And so, but I think, and I'm not a church historian, but but I think about a book that I read a number of years ago now called "The Patient Ferment of the Early Church," about the early centuries of the church, where in a season, in a time of powerlessness and weakness, Christians really thrived, in house churches and smaller contexts, in loving and being loved and taking care of the poor, right? But with the rise of Constantine and a growing sense of power that churches, pastors, bishops had, there was this sense that now we've got control, we've got power, we've got the power of the purse, we've got the power of Rome. And I do think that there's that sense that once you have power, and I see this, by the way, as narcissism evolves in pastors, once you have power, you become more self-protective. You want to protect that power. The church goes about protecting its power. There's a great Reformation centuries later, right? Obviously, but I see this in individual church planters who start out more humbly. I mean, I've done assessments with men and with women who start out in a place where they say to me, I'd never want that to happen to me. I don't want to be that kind of leader. I want to be a humble leader. I want to look more like Jesus than Mark Driscoll, and then 10 years in, things are going well. They've got a big stage. They're on YouTube. They've got lots of followers, whatever it is. And now they're becoming more insulated and they're beginning to protect their power. And I'm beginning to hear the stories of self-protection and maybe manipulation and exploitation. And so I think whenever we as individuals or as institutions or the church are in places where we become increasingly protective of our power, there's a tendency towards narcissism.
We definitely heard a few stories over the last few years of, particularly of like sexual abuse that gets covered up in some of these church systems where they want to insulate the leader from any kind of, of any kind of criticism and kind of keep those things under the rug, keep the image up, keep the checks and letters coming in.
Yeah. There's several notable cases, situations where that has caused. And to your point, what you were just saying, Chuck, I would think in your assessment that, of course, if anybody said, well, I want to be X, and you administering the assessment would obviously see that as a problem if they suggested that they did want to be, whatever. I can't find an example that's appropriate at the moment, but you would be alarmed, but just this system, because I think from my own personal involvement with the Episcopal Church as being on vestry and being a member of the Episcopal denomination and member of a congregation, there's elements that I love about the church and our progressive nature, but then also I can't help but also look at the patriarchy that still exists. And they're aware, they know this, but it's there, and they will protect the church. It's just, this is what they're going to do, because you also have people who have their livelihoods that are attached to it. And yes, they're all well-meaning, and yes, I love these people, but also it struggles. And then you mentioned the house churches, and that's why I gravitate towards small groups is where I find my faith most nurtured. So,
this is why we can't boil narcissism down to a problem of an individual, one person. If we just had a better testing process for that one person, this is where, we who are embedded in denominations and networks and things like that have to look at the cultures, and which include things like our organizational structures and our control systems and our power structures and even our various rituals and routines and liturgies and the stories, the narratives and stories we've told ourselves about our denomination. All of those things sort of have to be interrogated in the process for us to understand how and where narcissism, protection of power is embedded. And that, that takes a lot of humility. That takes self-awareness, and not a lot of people, not a lot of institutions are willing to do that,
Are we now getting into, we've been talking a lot about the narcissism of individuals, talking about the narcissism of systems, because I know that's something that you also get into in your book. How does that manifest itself?
Well, the reality is that it manifests in a similar way, except the system itself is now protecting power. The system itself feels entitled. I think one of the stories, I sometimes forget the stories that I tell even in the book, but I do think one of the stories I tell is of a large, I don't tell the name of it, but it's a large discipleship ministry that a friend of mine stepped in as the leader of. And he was shocked when he came into this ministry where he expected to find women and men longing to follow Jesus more deeply and sincerely and with integrity and faithfulness, that so much of the talk was about, we can be better than that other discipleship ministry.
Ooh.
And it was comparison and competition and power. And if only we produce these better resources, and if only we get our brand out there in a better way. And I remember he called me up, and this was probably a decade ago. He called me up dejected, like, I got to get out of here. There's nothing about this system that seems to me to be like the way of Jesus. And so, or the way of radical love, as you might put it on your podcast, that kind of radical love that Father Rohr talks about. And so, and so there's that, and that can be embedded in systems and enabled, as I said a few minutes ago, in our organizational structures, in the stories that we've told ourselves for years, in who controls power and how, et cetera.
So how do we begin to attack or pick apart narcissism? Because narcissism in itself seems like it's built to defend itself from outside attack. So it seems like, being an outside critic coming into a narcissistic system, or even talking to a narcissistic individual, is difficult and almost makes the situation worse to confront head on. That's why, at certain family dinners, everybody knows who that one person is who you just kind of defer to. That, or in church situations or business situations or whatnot. Is it only possible for a narcissist or narcissistic system to start to reform once it has some kind of like self-revelation or some kind of, like the three ghosts have to come and visit Scrooge in the middle of the night, or how?
I think that's true of individuals, and I think that's true of systems. That without some self-awareness, without some self-revelation, without a real sense of being humbled, and maybe even, again, as Rohr talks about, humiliated, there really isn't that possibility of a shift or movement, because we have to ask ourselves, and I think I'm talking to two middle-aged white guys. I'm a middle-aged white guy. How does power exist in my life, in my world, in my body, in my being, in the institution that I'm in? And what's my relationship to power, and how am I seeking to preserve it, or live in a way that I'm able to sort of give it away or empower others? And again, I said this earlier, that's tough, not just for individuals, but for systems. Like I'll have, let's say a church call me up, or denomination, and say, well, we want to move in that direction. But when I share the cost with them, or when I share the work that it will take, they're like, yeah, thanks, but no thanks. We're okay. Because the cost is just too significant. They'll lose power, they'll lose revenue, all those things that buttress power, right?
Exactly. And just to be clear, Chuck, you're not talking about their investment to pay you to help them. You're talking about the incurred cost systematically. What is the total price for this?
That's exactly it. That's exactly it. You can mess with this, we can maybe tweak a little bit there, but don't mess with that. We can maybe change a little bit of the structure, but the 5 men who are leading the organization, it's a non-negotiable that they're going to stay in power, that kind of thing. And so I think it's just hard for us to pivot in a direction, to shift from self-awareness to action.
So I like your analogy that you just used. I speak openly about my sobriety, and something that's saved my life. But what got me there was, of course, that moment of clarity to where, I came to the dead end and like, okay, well, if I continue this way, I most assuredly am going to, end in a very destructive way, and like end my life, not maybe that moment, but I could see it, like I could see my future right there. And knew that I had to change absolutely everything if I was to survive. So, 11 years plus forward into this journey, very grateful for that. But I had to have that hard reset. Like there was just nothing else because I was an alcoholic for years and years. I had people asking me, but I was the last person to know until that moment that I had my moment of clarity. Is this what you're suggesting is going to have must happen for some church systems or denominations or
Yeah, I
individual
think that's it.
churches?
I think that's it. Life had become unmanageable, right? And in a sense,
Life would be unmanageable. Yes.
yeah, and I had to
Oh, boy.
befriend that powerlessness personally, that
Mhm.
powerlessness
Yep.
institutionally, right? And so,
Yep.
yeah, I think that, yeah, it'd be wise for institutions at times to practice the 12 steps,
Yeah. Yeah.
and because there's a radical truth telling that has to happen in oneself and in one's relationships. But I just think we evade the truth about ourselves and about the systems. And again, I mean, I talk about this like I'm immune to it, but I want to protect my sense of power. I kind of like where I am. I have tenure now as a prof. I was in pastoral ministry. I want to lose any of that stuff. I want to like have my cake and eat it too, and so none of us is immune to this. And I think that's another one of the points of the book is this is not an us versus them, or this is like we've got it figured out, or I've got the right theology, but this really does implicate all of us. All of us have to take that journey to that honest admission that life has become unmanageable, that I'm powerless, that I've tried to control my life, whether I'm an Enneagram 1 or a 3 or a 5 or a 7 or even a 9. We even see narcissism in 9s, um,
Wow.
and uh, and move to that place of humility and curiosity.
I love it. So for our listeners that are not familiar with the Enneagram, I'm a 7 myself. Um, can you enlighten us just a little bit? Because that was fascinating. You brought
Yeah,
that in
I think we
earlier in the
actually need
conversation.
to do an episode on the Enneagram.
We really do.
Yeah.
So how does that apply to your work, and just kind of build that out for our listeners that are not familiar with the Enneagram? So if you can, Chuck.
Yeah, well, so the Enneagram, many of us believe, is an ancient tool with contemporary understandings, musings on its application, but really understands 9 different ways of operating and relating in the world. 9, you might say, 9 different masks that we wear, 9 different forms of self protection that are born out of our stories and probably somewhat a product of nature as well. And so, what I reflect on is the perfectionistic narcissism of the 1, um, the benevolent narcissism of the 2, the success addiction of the 3, and on and on. Really, what I think what's helpful about that, and this is what I say in the book. This is a kind of experimental. I put it out there, sort of like I'm soliciting some feedback. Like this is my stuff, uh, and I'm testing it out. But most who've come back to me have said it's fascinating because I thought that the classic, like Claudio Naranjo, one of the early Enneagram psychologists, said, by the way, that the 7 is the classic narcissist. Sorry to say. Um,
Probably. Okay.
Well, at least
and most
Oh,
people,
that's
I know
great.
you might guess most people would say it's a 3 or a 7 or an 8. But what I want to do is I want to sort of reflect on, the perfectionism of the 1, the intellectual superiority of the 5, the hypervigilance of the 6.
Mm.
Think about some of those hypervigilant fundamentalist theologians out there, right? That are like
Oh, yeah.
addicted to certainty, right? Of
Yeah.
course, the power addiction to power of the 8, et cetera, et cetera. And so, what are these different faces of narcissism? And how do we see each and every one of our Enneagram types as a way of evading longing, avoiding our limitations, and controlling our lives? And so I hope it's a helpful grid for some to say, how does this fit into my story? When it's so easy when we're talking about narcissism to say that's about that politician or that pastor.
Mhm.
Mhm, mhm. And that's, certainly, engaging with your book. I've had to do some self-reflection and go, "Oh, yeah, I guess there are some powerful positions, or certain social locations in my life that I do try
Yeah,
to protect
Oh, sure.
to some degree." And, and it's always good to continue. I try to live a life of continual self-reflection where I'm
yeah,
always doing the best I can with what I know, but staying open to the next new thing because I don't
that's
have it all
right.
figured out.
Yeah,
Mm.
yeah, and that's it. I mean, I think if we live with that sense of openness to what's happening within us, and take it a step deeper to our stories of pain, of trauma, and our strategies for self-protection, we're well on our way to living lives of curiosity and humility. But the reality is, and maybe you've seen this too, but I've seen this in spades in the church. There are many who are not willing to engage in those kinds of conversations, and
No, no.
some who think that those kinds of conversations are signs of weakness, and don't like the kind of vulnerability, the invitation to vulnerability that I'm offering.
So I'm going to throw something out there, and to your point where you say where somebody doesn't want to have this conversation, think about certain denominations that have had to deal with the same-sex marriage issue. So
Right.
we've seen the Episcopal Church have to deal with it. The Presbyterian Church had to deal with it. Let's see, the Lutherans had to deal with that. As we see what's inside the Evangelical Lutheran Church of America, ELCA. We see the United Methodist Church going through that right now. And I look at that thinking, okay, you're making decisions that clearly are based on, I don't know. Well, I actually can't say what you're basing them on, but other than fear, or just that we refuse to be self-reflective. But is that narcissism, or is that fear? And is there an interplay between narcissism and fear?
Yeah, I mean, I think narcissism is an extreme form of self-protection, right? A fearful self-protection, right? So yeah, it could be fear. But I think when we're talking about narcissism, we're talking about someone who's so insulated that there's not even a willingness to sort of open up just a little bit to a possibility that I'm wrong, or to open up a little bit to curiosity, or a little bit that maybe we haven't gotten this story right as a church over the course of the last decades or centuries, right? And that's the painful part, I think, in the conversation that you're talking about in these denominations, is there's not a willingness to say maybe we've missed something. Like how I grew up in the Reformed tradition. I'm sort of a son of the Reformed tradition, and I see this all over the place in the Reformed tradition, where we say we take sin very seriously, but there's not really a sense that we've missed much. There's not really what we would call an epistemic humility, that sense of maybe we've got it wrong. Like
Mhm.
maybe we missed something here. Maybe we need to kind of reopen that book and ask a few more questions. And so I think where there's that lack of personal epistemic humility, there's a tendency toward fear, self-protection, and maybe even narcissism.
Mm, mm. Well, because the reason why I brought this up is that it's playing at multiple levels here. You have the denomination itself, and of course there are synods that in the House of Bishops of these respective denominations and how they've done this. And the most recent example with the United Methodist Church, right? They voted to say, okay, we're going to allow the individual congregations to make the decision of are they going to stay or go within their respective synods, I think, or because they don't have dioceses in their
Yeah.
denomination, whatever organizational structure. But how some decide to, yes, we're going to progress and go forward, and others simply say, nope, I'm not. And they may be in the same town. Is it the personality of the congregation? What drives that? I mean, it's interesting to me how this is all, that interplay plays out.
Yeah, and I think part of what you get at is what do you need to protect? Are there people? Are there systems? Are there forms of polity? Are there creeds, councils, documents, attendance, money, resources? All these things that we want to protect that don't allow us reputation. Influence, followers, all these things that keep us from moving toward places of growing curiosity and humility and openness and radical love, you might say. And so, and that's, each of us has to sort of ask ourselves the question, what am I trying to protect?
Mm.
And that's hard. I mean, that's a hard one for me too. And I do this for a living with other people, but I'm
Mhm.
still protecting a lot.
It's interesting to see, even just in the last couple of weeks, I've seen online. Sometimes I still go to Twitter, even though it's like
Mm.
the
Thing not to do. Yeah.
hotbed of polarized
now.
views.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah, X, and
Uh,
it's definitely exciting there. That, but I see, some younger religious thinkers who are trying to break some of these systems by taking them head on, and just making some statements that you would think would get somebody to stop and think. I saw a tweet the other day, where someone said, if Paul was wrong about Jesus coming back in his lifetime, maybe he didn't get it right about homosexuality. Or,
Mhm.
yeah, or, and that was Mason Manega was the
Yeah.
writer of that. And then a few weeks before that, Tyler Huckabee posted something about. He was like, "Well, if the Bible was wrong about slavery, maybe we have gay marriage wrong too." And
Yeah.
and
Mm.
rather than somebody going, "Huh, that's interesting. That does get me thinking a little bit." Just pure vitriolic attack after
Yeah.
attack after
Wow.
attack, that it was, the walls went up of like, you have attacked my orthodoxy in such a way that I can't even begin to consider another way of looking at it.
Yeah. Yeah. Isn't that interesting? Right. And so I'm a therapist, and I see this also through the lens of the autonomic nervous system and the self-protective mechanisms within. Right. And so immediately, instead of someone stopping and trying to get centered and saying, how does that impact me? They go into fight mode.
Mhm.
The sympathetic nervous system kicks in cortisol, adrenaline, and they're off to the races with tweet after tweet after tweet of defense and argument. And that's not the pathway to curiosity and humility, right? And so this is where we've got to do our own work. And I get it. I have some empathy. I mean, these are women and men out there who feel like when a statement like that is made, like if that's allowed to be put out there into the world, we might just lose everything, the
Mhm.
foundations, which to me, um, reflects is a theological reflection. I mean, isn't God, you know, isn't God big enough to hold these things at some level for these people who
Mm.
supposedly
Right.
have such a big orthodoxy, right?
Right.
Right,
Uh,
right.
but God doesn't seem all that powerful, I think, at times in these theologies and in these, you know, uh, in these particular networks and institutions and stuff. And so I see it playing out. To be honest, I just get really sad, because it's just sympathetic nervous system fight versus sympathetic nervous system fight in a lot of these back and forths. And it doesn't forward the movement of insight, awareness, and love ultimately.
Mm. So can we get political for a second without naming names? Well, actually, we're going to have to
I
in this
see the
case.
name of the person on
Yeah,
your
sorry, I
screen.
actually have to. So there's a great piece in the New York Times, at least I think it is. That's my personal opinion. In the New York Times yesterday on January 11th.
Mm.
The title of the piece is "Trump is connecting with a different type of evangelical voter. They're not just the church-going conservative activist who once dominated the GOP." That's the subtitle to it. So it's a very long piece. We're not going to break it all down on the time we have here. But the point of it is the people that he's attracting and other politicians of his nature overwhelmingly don't go to church anymore, but yet they call themselves Christians.
I think regardless of what they call themselves, there's a CIA profiler out there named Gerald Post who's written a lot on this, of narcissism, you might say, in politicians. He looks at Bill Clinton, he looks at
Hmm?
Donald Trump,
Sure.
and what's interesting there is he says, every narcissist is mirror hungry. In other words, his audience is his mirror. But he
Mhm.
said their followers are ideal hungry. In other words, um, the narcissistic leader meets certain needs, fundamental needs in his or her followers. A need for security, a need for belonging, a need for certainty. And so there's the idea of the ideal hungry follower that looks at the world and says, the world is going to hell in a handbasket, and this is the only leader for security, for belonging, for protection, for whatever it is. Um, he's the one who will deliver it for me. And so there's this mutually sort of reinforcing dynamic between leader and follower. And so it's interesting. I think that I haven't done this work. I think there could be some really good work done by those who might look at, well, what are these ideal hungry followers looking for, whether they call themselves Christians or not, or are in churches or not in churches, or identify as Christian but don't go to, whatever it is. What's the idea? What are they hungering for? Makes sense. And so maybe one of you guys want to write that book.
Yeah.
That's it's because it's interesting that we've been talking about narcissism for from the perspective of the benefit of the narcissist themselves, of what they're protecting. But there are others who also benefit from that system, like others who get somebody who to follow, somebody who,
Sure.
like for all their bluff and bluster, I know that that's the guy that's going to defend my beliefs
Yeah.
against the deep state and against all these like leftists that are trying to
Yeah.
make us all
Yep.
wear dresses. And that it's
Oh, is that a part of our agenda now? We're going to make everybody wear dresses? Oh,
that's
okay.
right.
Wow.
Yeah. Until
That's
they
a new
find
one.
out they're the bride of Christ. Sorry.
Don't
no,
tell them that, man. That freaks them out.
I always throw that one out there. Sorry.
Too far.
Well, that's it. And this is where those who've, been a part of churches or ministries or followed politicians like this, when their eyes are open to that dynamic, well, then they're going to have to do the work of looking at themselves and their own story and what they plug themselves into that leader for, and again, it's will they go on a journey of awareness, and will they seek humility and grow in curiosity? But I've worked with plenty of women and men who are survivors of narcissistic systems who wanted to sort of look at the narcissistic leader and blame them, but eventually had to sort of turn to themselves and say, so what did I need? What was I plugging into? And I think that takes a lot of courage to do that.
So as we're seeing, a lot of the traditional religious systems are, not doing as well population wise these days. We're seeing decline in church attendance. People are starting to find new ways of finding community. A lot of it is online through, some of the groups we engage with. What are ways that people can build the groups that they're building now and try to just be conscious of not building narcissism into the system?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I think, I'm not an expert in systems and building systems. I've had this conversation with some folks who said, we need to renounce power. We need to go to sort of egalitarian systems. And what I've often said by way of pushback is we all have power. It's what we do with our power. And so we need to be mindful of our power. And when we are in systems where we do have power, I have power in the institution I'm in as a white middle-aged male. We need to be cognizant of how we're using it. And does our power exploit or bless? And so that's the question that I think I ask myself, and I want to ask institutions. Am I one who is contributing to the empowerment of others, the humble use of my power, or am I exploitative in my power? And so I think as you build systems, it's pretty inevitable, whether we're talking about individuals or systems, that there will be this sense which, as they grow in terms of their size and resources, they will gain power. But what's their relationship with power? What's their sense of awareness of that power? And I've seen in good, healthy systems, empowered leaders relinquish some of their power along the way, or step out of leadership and empower someone else. And those are the beautiful stories, right? Great, sort of create systems and structures that empower others. And I've seen it where people who are well-intentioned, who go in with pretty good theology, pretty good ideas, end up intoxicated with power. And I'm sure you've seen that as well too. And so, it's easy to go down that road, and we all have to do, as I say over and over again, we have to do our work, got to do our inner work.
Absolutely. Chuck, thank you so much for saying that. And we're, getting close to our time, but we would be remiss if we did not talk about religious abuse. And I think just this last point, you were touching up to it. So you do work in this space, and can you enlighten us a little bit about, not so much about the description of a religious abuse, although if you want to throw that in there, but what are you doing? What work are you doing with that?
So when we talk about spiritual abuse, religious abuse, we're talking about the exploitation of power, exploitation of others, right? And so, and I work in systems, I work with denominations, I work with survivors of spiritual abuse, of religious abuse. And part of the work is naming how abuse takes place and bringing individuals and systems to accountability. On the other side, what I'm working more with today, or currently writing on, because I think it's really important, is religious trauma. So abuse is what happened. Religious trauma is what happens within, in our thoughts, our emotions, our bodies, our relationships, interpersonally, right? So, and that's where the real healing takes place, right? And so we can hold religious abusers accountable. We can tell the story of what happened within systems or among individuals, but how do we turn our attention to what happens within? And the title of my next book is actually Healing What's Within. It's that shift from what happened to you to what's happening within you.
Mm, I love that. I'm going to ask you a question that um, I have this. I have my own personal experience with religious abuse and what subsequent to the trauma, because trauma comes from the abuse. Thankfully, my story is not an individual. It wasn't anything that was done to me physically or emotionally. It was just the system of what I learned about what was the Christian tradition and how it was going to harm me as being a queer person. So, and it did a lot of damage, but I'm blessed and fortunate that I've been able to reconcile to that. My point is, I feel like I'm one of the few, unfortunately, that I was given the grace to be able to do this. Unfortunately, when somebody is traumatized, they give up on their belief systems. Am I right to believe that? Have you seen any studies? Or what work have you done as a therapist so what happens to that person that gets abused and traumatized? Where do they go?
Yeah, well, I mean, I hope they find their way to a spiritual director, to a therapist who is trauma informed and who can hold space for them with a lot of empathy, right?
Yeah,
And we're not there to impose the right beliefs, the right thoughts, but are
exactly.
willing, because when you experience trauma, um, calls into question everything that you've known, everything you've believed, everyone you've trusted, right? And
Yes,
that
all of that.
takes a while. All that deconstructive work takes a while to work through. I don't
Absolutely.
want to put a timetable on it. An unfolding process, and so but you need to work with someone who's going to honor you and honor that process and honor your own unique woundedness, right? And
Yeah.
not map their own sort of system or way of doing it onto you. And so, yeah, to find a safe, trauma informed therapist or spiritual director is really, really important in these circumstances, right?
Yeah, absolutely, Chuck. Thank you for sharing that. And that's true, because there's definitely hope there. And at that point that somebody has now started healing from the trauma, that from my own personal experience, speaking first person, that then is what allowed me to then reopen the door of engaging the divine, and me thinking about what is my framework of faith, to where now I have a very healthy, fulfilling faith system that works for me. It is not, systematic. I mean, I take elements from that, but as a friend of our program, Alicia Crosby Mack will say, I am spiritually promiscuous, and I love being that. I'm in wilderness by design, because that's where I find fulfillment to the divine for me. It works for me,
Yeah.
but I got there, thankfully. So,
Yeah. Yeah. Well, yeah. Thank you.
mm,
Well, thank you so much. I actually would love for this conversation to keep going. Every question I've got, I think it would have another like 45-minute answer. So we'd love to invite you to come back sometime to continue to talk about these topics.
yeah.
But we are at time. So just want to say thank you so much for your insights and for the work that you do.
Yeah.
Do you have any upcoming work or events or anything that you want to tell our listeners about?
Yeah. I mean, it's this next book that I've written will come out in October of 2024. It's interesting because people sort of wanted me to do a follow up to the narcissism book. I didn't really want to do like a narcissism 2.0 or 201, right? But as we've talked about, really turn the attention to how we negotiate trauma in our own lives. And so this is what I'm proud of. I probably put more into the writing and the formation of this than I've done with anything else that I've written. So that's what's coming up in this in 2024. I'm excited about that. So thanks for letting me say that.
Absolutely.
Awesome.
All right. Well, Chuck, again, I look forward to our paths crossing again.
Yeah.
Fascinating conversation. I hope our listeners get as much out of this as I personally did. It's been a pleasure and an honor to have you on with us. And so with that, I guess it's time for us to call this episode a wrap.
That's right. Thank you. And enjoy the snow. Enjoy.
And your snow club.
Yes.
Appreciate it, guys. Take care.
All right. Well, Chuck.
Take care.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Radical Love Live, co-hosted by Mark Dilcom and Kelly Wilson. All rights reserved. You can find our podcast on Spotify, Apple, Stitcher, and other popular podcast platforms. Go to radicallovelive.com to learn more about us, watch recordings of our live events, and listen to our podcast. We also invite you to check out what Kelly and Mark are doing by going to our websites. Find Kelly at kellywilson.com and Mark at markdilcom.com. This is Radical Love Live, where we explore faith outside the boxes.